We hope that you've enjoyed trying your hand at making those delicious dishes at home, and we would love to see your final results, be they beautiful or diabolical. So please don't forget to share them at #LeightonLate and #Museums from Home. Now it's time for a little visual inspiration. This is an opportunity to explore your favourite corners of Leighton House from the comfort of your own home. And we'd like to invite you to open our brand new Room in Focus resource. You're going to feel as if you had the museum all to yourself, and you can take the chance to listen more about your favourite object, learning its story through our specially curated video and audio descriptions.
Welcome to Leighton House Museum and this investigation into the ideas and aesthetics that influenced its enigmatic creator Frederick Leighton. Leighton was born in 1830 in Scarborough, the son of a doctor, Frederick Septimus and Augusta Nash. However, just 3 years later the family would move to London, before eventually relocating to Frankfurt in 1846. It was here that he was given the freedom to embark on his artistic training, and subsequently to travel extensively within Europe and the Middle East, collecting works of art and ideas along the way. Thus, the motivation for building this extraordinary palace of art on his return to London was in order to create an exhibition space in which he could display the exquisite collections he'd accumulated on his travels, objects and aesthetics that would ultimately influence the trajectory of his own work. A fascination with classical forms, Italian art and Middle Eastern ceramics, amongst others, dictated the opulent decoration in the house, an aesthetic he would eventually incorporate into his paintings as well. The domestic aspect of the house, as we will discover on this exploration of the museum, was very secondary. Aestheticism was the dominant influence in the design of the house and was a movement defined by the relatively radical notion of art for art's sake, which emphasised the visual and sensual qualities of art over the traditional focus on moral, practical or narrative considerations. The stylised floral patterns and gilded medallions we see here are one of the most obvious manifestations of Leighton's interpretation of this style, and were clearly informed by the biomorphic patterns he'd encountered on his explorations in the Middle East, particularly in Syria and Turkey. They are found in much of the woodwork throughout the house and provide a sense of coherence within the eccentric beauty of the place. This copy of a Roman sculpture, Dancing Faun, is one of many casts which were made after the original was dug up in Pompeii in 1830. As with the sculpture of Narcissus in the adjoining room, casts of these recently excavated statues quickly became very fashionable in the 19th century. For Leighton, whose artwork was always grounded in the classical, these sculptures were important additions to the house both aesthetically and as inspiration for his own artworks. These exquisite turquoise tiles were the creation of the arts and crafts ceramicist William de Morgan. De Morgan's involvement in the house was initially focused on replacing tiles which had been lost or broken on the journey back from the Middle East, and to make sense of the vast number of tiles to be built into the Arab hall, but also to fill the spaces in between with a colour that would best enhance the Iznik and Syrian ceramics to be displayed. De Morgan was brilliantly experimental, starving the kiln of oxygen to achieve this complex iridescent glaze that is so integral to the overall aesthetic colour scheme of the peacock blue, the black and the gold. The Arab Hall is essentially a kind of Victorian aesthetic pastiche of the 12th century Moorish-style architecture that Leighton had seen at Palazzo Lazisa in Sicily, combined with some decorative details found at the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Created in order for Leighton to display his extraordinary collection of predominantly 16th and 17th century Syrian tiles, the abundance and eclecticism of the decorative detail within the space is truly extraordinary. Though for all its atmospheric and enigmatic beauty, it allegedly soon became simply an after-dinner smoking room. One guest recalled an evening attended by the artists Edward Burne-Jones and James McNeill Whistler, where two Japanese tench quietly minding their own business in the fountain were somewhat surprised to be joined by a dinner guest, who had been enthusiastically discoursing on some topic and had inadvertently reversed into the water. These bell-shaped recesses found in all four corners of the Arab Hall are known as squinches, and architecturally would traditionally have been part of the support for the dome or cupola. However, in this aesthetic context, they've been deconstructed and have instead become part of the sumptuous decoration that reaches towards the dome above. This gold mosaic frieze was designed by the Victorian children's illustrator Walter Crane, using ideas and motifs Leighton had seen at the Sicilian-Norman palace Palazzo Lazisa. Following the same format as Lazisa, sets of 3 roundels on a gold ground were designed for each wall. The central roundel seen here contains an eagle wrestling a snake and is flanked by images of sphinxes with their flaming torches. Other designs included peacocks and cockatoos, alongside the signs of the zodiac, in line with Leighton's desire to create an impression of the starry heavens. These aesthetic details of stylized floral incisions and gilded medallions were strongly influenced by the biomorphic patterns that Leighton had encountered in Islamic art on his travels in the Middle East. The designs inhabit the majority of the door surrounds, and much of the woodwork, including the central staircase, reinforcing this concept of art for art's sake, and establishing a coherent, consistent decorative scheme that runs throughout the house. The Murano glass chandelier, suspended from the ceiling of the drawing room, is a style that was particularly fashionable at the time, and its flamboyant, intricate presence was an integral part of this aesthetic scheme, where the interplay between ostentatious design and moments of restraint or understatement is key, as evidenced in the decoration of this particular room. These paintings by Charlie Cobb are after a series of 4 pictures that Leighton purchased by one of his favourite artists, Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot. They show the changing light in 4 different stages of the day, and are typical of Corot's plein-air depictions of naturalistic landscapes, working the paint in a loose impasto style which would both influence and anticipate the Impressionists. This portrait of Robert Rankin is an interesting example of how diverse the evolution of an artist's career can be. The artist, John Everett Millais, was best known as one of the protagonists of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, formed in 1848. Their manifesto was to return art to the integrity of medieval times, both in craft and concept. They felt that art had become frivolous since the Renaissance, and referred to Sir Joshua Reynolds as Sir Sloshua. They focused mainly on literary and religious subject matter, and insisted upon paintings made with rich colours, complex compositions, and close attention to detail in nature. However, the movement, whilst influential, was short-lived. There was little demand for work of this intense, didactic nature. So this portrait, painted at a much later point in his career, contains none of these utopian ideals, with the exception perhaps of the poppy-filled landscape beyond. This sculpture by Leighton doesn't look especially radical to our eyes, but it was thanks to this work that he was recognised as the pioneer of a movement called New Sculpture. It was innovative for its modern sense of realism and dynamism. The work was designed in a spiral, encouraging it to be viewed in the round and thus from multiple perspectives, creating an energised and vital form, as opposed to the prevailing style of static, idealised neoclassicism. Part of the magic of Leighton House is how it subtly reveals the personality of its creator and his particular take on aestheticism, a compelling style which plays on a dialogue between ostentation and understatement. The fireplace is a sublime example of this interplay. Its relative simplicity momentarily allows the viewer to pause and contemplate, whilst the placement of the window atop the mantel is pure art for art's sake. It is a functioning fireplace with a flue that travels to the left through the wall, but the priority here is clearly in the sense of proportion and beauty. By night, a mirrored panel will be drawn across the window to further heighten this sensuous aesthetic. This painting depicting Michelangelo and his dying servant is a brilliant example of Leighton's early neoclassical painting. Highly schooled and fairly conventional, the neoclassical style typically focused on mythological and historical subject matter, and in its method drew on Greek and Roman sculpture for its forms, draperies, postures, and gestures. Other manifestations of this neoclassicism include its sense of proportion and understated grandeur, and the subtle sense of pathos and melancholy, highlighted by the chiaroscuro, this use of light and shade to reveal contrast and emotion. In Leighton's late style of painting, he would incorporate the beauty and sensuous qualities he'd used in the interiors of the house into his pictures. He would continue to ground his paintings in the classical vocabulary, but the colours would burn much brighter and the forms would start to become something ultimately more abstract and enigmatic. These ceramics that hang on the walls are from Iznik in Turkey. They're not the original ceramics owned by Leighton, but are instead by a modern Iznik artist called Ismail Yiğit. Yiğit has revived the trade with great integrity to the original designs, using the biomorphic floriated patterns that were so influential for Leighton, and the original colour schemes of the late Iznik pottery, combining white and blue and turquoise with reds and purples. They're also arranged against the velvety texture of the red flock wallpaper in the typically aesthetic way that Leighton would have had them. The sideboard is not the original, but a modern interpretation by a craftsman called Luke Hughes. It's a wonderful replica of a piece that Leighton and his architect George Aitchison designed together for the house. This touches on the arts and crafts philosophy that you would never simply design the shell of a house, but would instead consider every aspect, holistically. Thus they designed numerous pieces of furniture for the house that would be in tune with the architecture itself. This Turkish 17th century wedding chest was very typical of Leighton's love of highly decorative furniture, often incorporating the wood marquetry and intricate ivory inlay we see here. It's also a brilliant example of his innovative approach to objects and their apparent versatility. He turned the chest into a seat, which is revealed as you walk up the stairs. The textiles for this creation were embroidered with patterns by the artist and garden designer Gertrude Jekyll. This portrait of Frederick Leighton was affectionately painted by his good friend George Frederick Watts. This friendship was one of the reasons that Leighton moved to the area, as Watts was living nearby at the Little Holland house with the Prinsep family. When Leighton bought the plot from the Holland estate, there were only 2 other extant houses in the immediate area, that belonging to the Princeps and the old dairy next door. By the end of the 19th century, there were at least 22 artists living in the vicinity, many living in homes inspired by the unusual artist studio house that Leighton had pioneered. Jacopo Tintoretto's style of painting was hugely influential for Leighton, particularly in the Venetian colour palette of rich, dark oils which were so dominant in Leighton's early work. The genius of Tintoretto, so admired by Leighton, can be seen in the subtle distinction between the silk of the sleeve, the delicate lace of the cuff, and the fur stole. But it's in the face that the picture becomes alive. The flesh is so palpable we can almost detect the physical presence of this Venetian gentleman. In Leighton's painting of Desdemona, the ill-fated wife of Othello, he used his favourite model, an actress called Dorothy Dean. She features in the great majority of his figurative works in some capacity, but also essentially became Leighton's companion in life. This image of a girl shelling peas by John Everett Millais was given to Leighton by the artist in exchange for a cast of the sculpture Needless Alarms, designed in 1886. Millais was predominantly known for being one of the protagonists of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood formed in 1848, a group motivated by their utopian desire for a better world, which they sought through a longing for the medieval period, encouraging a return to the values and integrity of that time. Leighton's depiction of the tragic mythological tale of Orpheus's attempt to rescue his wife Eurydice from the clutch of Hades in the underworld through the power of music is a fine example of Leighton's early neoclassical style. In a similar vein to the Michelangelo and his dying servant in the dining room, we see the influence of classical sculpture in the figures, draperies, postures and gestures, and also in the sense of grandeur and heroism. Once again, the emotion of the story is heightened by the chiaroscuro or play of light and shade, but the palette remains muted. Yet we do get a glimpse of the almost musical dynamic quality that would become so integral in his late aesthetic style. Leighton gave a cast of Needless Alarms to his friend John Everett Millais in exchange for the latter's painting of Shelling Peas, which hangs a bit nearby in the Silk Room. It's a fine example of Leighton as the pioneer of new sculpture in its dynamic interpretation of the traditionally static classical forms. The subject matter, though, is somewhat curious, the apparently common occurrence in Victorian times of a naked girl being scared by a frog. Clytie is really the museum's finest example of Leighton's late aesthetic style of painting, where he began to incorporate the high decoration of the house into his pictures and leave behind the restraints of the more conventional neoclassicism. The mythological subject depicts the despairing Clytie who is left to watch her unrequited love, the sun god Helios, fly across the sky every day. However, the focus in this period begins to move away from the narrative in painting and instead towards the intensity of emotion evoked. Leighton creates this enigmatic quality through the almost symbolist structure of the image. The forms are still very much grounded in the classical, but become ever so slightly contorted, rhythmic and musical. Sentient and beautiful, the picture is full of longing and what it is to be human and to feel. The colours change too, becoming richer, brighter, more decorative, and imbued with the golden light that Leighton had captured during his intense studies of landscapes around the Mediterranean. This was Leighton's last painting, still on the canvas when he died, and whilst it is still obviously figurative, it's the beginnings of something quite modern, using form and colour to express human emotions and sensations. This painting of the dying Brunelleschi, architect of Florence's famous Duomo, was Leighton's first major piece, his graduate piece. Thus we see him demonstrating all his various technical skills, from the musculature of the dog, the intricacy of the lavish silks and textiles, the grisaille detail of the classical relief in the architecture, and the vaguely fantastical Florentine scene that guides the eye to the Duomo beyond. Indeed, in 1894, Leighton was awarded a gold medal by the Royal Institute of British Architects on the basis that he displayed an intellectual grasp and familiar knowledge of our art which has influenced and cannot fail to influence materially the promotion of architecture. In the opulent and abundant decoration of the house, we see the public face of Frederick Leighton. However, a glimpse of his bedroom gives us some insight into the private life of the man, one that was markedly understated by contrast, with none of the decorative adornments on the door surrounds that are so prolific in the rest of the house, instead the use of simple, plain panels. The room has an almost monastic, contemplative quality, with a simple brass bed, typically used in servants' quarters, a relatively restrained William Morris India pattern wallpaper, and a Victorian cluster of black and white prints of famous old master paintings. Moments of understatement and simplicity are evident throughout the house, but this sense of the modesty of the man is most evident in his bedroom. And so we end this exploration of the house, which I hope has given you some sense of the extraordinary beauty of the place. We're so looking forward to being able to welcome you back to the museum in order to fully immerse yourself in the unique sensory experience that is Frederick Leighton's aesthetic palace.